take up that very important issue a little later on, Mr. Scargill, but first of all ask you about the possibility of a resumption of peace talks. As I indicated, Mr. Orme has talked to you, he's talked to Mr. McGregor. Is there this morning any prospect at all of the two of you getting back round the negotiating table?
Oh, yes, indeed, as far as I'm concerned. Stan Orme approached me sometime last week and said, would we be willing to meet the National Coal Board? And we said, yes, certainly. We didn't want to terminate the discussions when we met in London a week previously. Unfortunately, the Coal Board did, and they broke off the discussions. As far as we're concerned, we'll meet tomorrow morning if they wish, but I understand that the Coal Board have said no.
But and there's no circumstances have changed as far as you understand. I mean, there's nothing fresh for you to bite on, is that what you're saying? What
I'm saying is that the negotiations which were taking place, in my view, should have continued, because when two sides are talking, it's a lot better from everybody's point of view, and there's always a possibility of a solution. And I regret the fact that the National Coal Board saw no longer the possibility of continuing those negotiations.
I presume that the stumbling block is still this whole question of what the NCV deemed to be uneconomic pitch. And there's one thing I'd like to get clear with you right from the outset, and that's this. Are you saying that pits should be kept open no matter what the price, no matter how much it costs to get the coal out of those pits?
What I'm saying, and what the union's always said, and it's not Arthur Scargill, it's the union, that we should not have any closures on economic grounds. There are certain definitions of what constitutes an exhausted pit, and within those definitions, all categories of collieries could fit. Let me give you one example. If there is a colliery where there's a block of coal, say 2 miles away from the pit bottom, and it would take something like 12 to 18 months to develop towards that block of coal, and in the period between the development and the actual operation of that coal unit, men would have to be transferred away from the pit. And if and when they got to that block of coal, there was only 3 months or 6 months operation. No mining engineer, and certainly no trade union official, would possibly argue that that pit should be kept open. The Coal Board know that, and we know that. But this isn't about that sort of thing. The Coal Board are wanting to close, on their own admission, 12% of what they deem are uneconomic pits. That's 70 pit closures.
But they, you have to confess, are just as expert in this as you, and they say, and many people would agree with them, that it doesn't make any sense at all to keep those pits open, particularly bearing in mind the losses they announced last week. £800 million. Why should the government, why should the taxpayer foot a bill like that?
Well, the answer is a very simple one. The cost of making people redundant in the mining industry is twice as much as keeping those pits open, and I would have thought that was a very sensible answer. Secondly, the only reason we've got pits which they can describe as uneconomic is because there's not been proper investment. The difference between a North East pit, a South Wales pit, a Scottish pit, and say a Yorkshire or a Nottinghamshire pit, is that those pits in the Nottinghamshire and Yorkshire areas have had some investment in them. Other pits in other parts of the country have been starved of investment.
The government argue, of course, that they're investing £2 million a day in the coal industry. Are you saying that's enough, that it should be more?
I'm saying it's certainly not enough if you want to have a developing and expanding coal industry in line with a signed agreement. And let me remind you that the Conservative government, as well as the Labour government, agreed as recently as 1981 that the plan for coal should operate, and that foresaw 135 million tonnes of deep mine coal production by next year. And they're now talking about 97 million
But
tonnes.
at the end of the day, are you not asking this government and the National Coal Board to provide for your workers privileges that no other worker has? No one's going to get the sack. They're all going to be offered alternative employment, and if they don't want to take up that employment, they're going to get a very handsome payoff. Now, if I worked in a shop that suddenly didn't make a profit, I wouldn't be offered a deal like that. Why should the miners get it?
Well, I'll put the question back to you, if I may. You see, if we want to dispense with your services as an interviewer on TVAM, I suggest to you it's not your job. It belongs to someone else. And if you want to leave, well, that's fine. But that job opportunity should be provided for someone else who wants to come in. And in the same way, in a mining community, the job opportunities with 4.5 million out of work do not belong to an individual, bearing in mind that the cost of making people redundant is twice as much as keeping them in work. There's no economic reason why we should do that. But let me say this. We produce the cheapest deep mine coal in the world. And there seems to me to be no sensible reason why we cannot begin to sell our coal abroad, provided we understand that the only reason we can't compete is because the communist government of Poland and the West German government provided an enormous subsidy, ranging from 25 to 60 pounds a tonne, whilst the British government ignores that fact of life.
The government argue, of course, that they've got to draw the line somewhere. Now, I'll put another point here, and that's this. Doesn't the movement that we've seen in the last 7 days by some miners apparently wanting to go back to work indicate that they, too, now consider this whole rationale, this whole reasoning of yours absolutely unrealistic? Doesn't it show that they've come to the conclusion that some pit closures are inevitable?
No, it doesn't. And in fact, if you look at the facts of the situation, they do not bear comparison with what you've just said. 80% of British miners are on strike and have been since the beginning of March.
But would you
and
not concede even more now want to
are
go back to
also
work?
on strike. And as far as I'm concerned, there's been no more indication in the last week or 2 weeks that people want to return to work than at any time since the beginning of this dispute. Miners recognise that they've either accept pit closures or they fight against them. I believe they'll continue this fight until we win.
Doesn't the story in Saturday's Daily Express about miners in your own area, Yorkshire, apparently considering taking you to court over the action you've taken, deciding in their view that the action you took was improper, at least give you pause for thought? Doesn't that give you the impression that more and more people are deciding this strike isn't worth a light, it isn't worth fighting for?
No, it doesn't. And of course, when people start talking about taking me to court or anyone else to court, it demonstrates no more than people are wanting to use the system and the anti-government trade union laws to try and stop an action which is designed to save jobs. We're fighting for the right to work. We're fighting to save communities. And the fact is that the NUM conference, mandated by branches, unanimously, and for the benefit of anybody looking at this programme, that means everybody, voted at our annual conference to take strike action if there was any attempt to close pits, and that's the policy that I'm carrying out.
That's not what they're saying. They said that delegate conference, a decision was taken to take action over pit closures, but not strike action. Now, do they not have a point?
No, they don't have a point. I'm sorry. The decision of the special conference was to take strike action, and there's no ambiguity about it. And over the past 4 years at our annual conference, we've also said that we'll take strike action. And I'm a servant of the union. And until that conference decision was taken, I didn't come out and say where I stood on the matter. Once the decision was taken, I fought for that decision.
Let me just return to that lady we saw on interview earlier on in the introduction to this item. Do you not think that there are now increasing numbers of miners and their wives who want to return to work because, frankly, they can't stand the hardship which you have actually subjected them to?
Well, again, you see, this is about the 4th time in this programme that you've said that. I've subjected them to, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. Now, I'll try once more. The fact is that the National Coal Board announced a pit closure programme. The National Union of Mine Workers Delegate Conference, representing all miners, decided that they would take strike action. And as their president, I carry out their policy.
But what about the hardship those people are suffering as a result of that action, Mr. Scargill?
I hope that that's clear. What happens now is that we've gone into 21 weeks of strike action. And obviously, the hardship is absolutely unbearable. But that's the responsibility of those who are trying to inflict butchery on this industry, and in particular Mr. Ian McGregor. This dispute can be over tomorrow, provided Mr. McGregor will withdraw his pit closure plan. Let me tell you this. He said at the 6th of March meeting he wanted to take 4 million tonnes of capacity out of this industry this year. Already in this strike, 50 million tonnes of production have been lost. Now, why, with nearly 14 times the amount he wanted to take out being lost, does he still want to suggest that the pit closure plan that he announced should continue? The answer is simple. He wants to close not 20 pits. He wants to close 70 pits and get rid of 70,000 jobs. And I'm sorry, it's not on.
Something you know he denies. Let me put one final point to you about the hardship. Do you, as the president of the National Union of Mine Workers, a man who quite properly enjoys all the trappings of that position, a nice car, a nice flat when you're in London and on what could be deemed to be a rich man's housing development, do you understand the hardship which is being inflicted on ladies like that lady from South Wales, on ladies in your own community in Yorkshire, and do you care?
I understand much better than a privileged interviewer on TVAM what the problems are in the mining communities, bearing in mind that the whole of my salary since February has been donated to the strike fund, including the fee from this TV programme. But let me say this. It's time that people like you began to understand the hardship without just talking about it in a distant way. The fact is that our people are suffering intolerable problems in the mining communities. They haven't got food, they haven't got light, they haven't got heat, simply because of this government's policy. But they recognise that the only thing they can do, faced with the butchery of their communities, the destruction of a way of life, is to fight against those policies. We aim to win the fight for the right to work. And after all, it's a very noble aim. We don't want our children to join the ranks of the unemployed. And I would have thought that even you could have supported that.
Mr. Scargill, we're going to pause it there for a moment, take a break, and continue the discussion in just a couple of minutes. Stay with us. In case you're just joining us, I'm talking to the miners' leader, Mr. Arthur Scargill, at a time when there are fears that he and his colleagues will step up the picketing, which has led to unprecedented industrial violence. After a meeting of the NUM executive on Thursday, Mr. Scargill threatened to tighten the knot and extend the campaign against pit closures within the coalfield and outside. His statement came at the end of a week which saw more trouble on the picket lines, with police yet again fighting miners at the now notorious Bilston Glen colliery near Edinburgh. And at Bavington in Nottinghamshire, tempers flared and 70 pickets were arrested in some of the worst clashes seen so far in the dispute. But Notts Police Chief Charles McLaughlin made his position very clear indeed.
Chairman, I would be delighted to send all these policemen back to their own forces tomorrow, if I could guarantee that I will not have intimidation and violence at the pit gate. Well, who am I to serve? Am I to serve the people who are coming in to attack Nottinghamshire people and beat the living daylights out of them if they get a chance? Or do I serve the people who are being beaten? I serve the people who are being beaten, and this committee does too.
So, what does Mr Scargill mean by tightening the knot? Does it mean he's looking for more support from other trade unions, or does it mean he wants the picketing stepped up? And if so, what implications will that have for the role of the police in Britain? Well, as I indicated, Mr Scargill is with me now. What do you mean, Mr Scargill, by tightening the knot? Does it mean more picketing, potentially more violence on the picket lines?
It means both things. It means, first of all, more support from the rest of the trade union movement, and already I've had discussions with the TUC Acting General Secretary and the Chairman of the TUC. And secondly, of course, it means stepping up the picketing in an attempt to further curtail the flow of coal and coke and other materials into power stations, steelworks and other industrial users.
Well, let me just take up the point about picketing. Where's that support going to come from, and what areas are you thinking about hitting?
What we're doing is talking to other miners and talking to other workers in the British industrial scene. We're seeking to impart our case to them in a time-honoured and traditional way. And, you know, I resent the implication of the Chief Constable of Nottinghamshire. He's established in the Nottinghamshire area, with the connivance of this government, a police state. It's not me that suddenly starts to fly helicopters in the middle of the night with searchlights and turn this into something resembling South Africa. It's not me, but him, who imposes in villages a method of pass laws where people can't move from one part of a village to the other unless they tell them who they are and where they're going. It's not me, but him, who knock people up in the middle of the night and say, have you got a Yorkshire or a Durham miner staying with you? And if they have, they're sent back. And after all they're trying to do is to say to other workers, join our dispute and help us win.
But, you know, you saw what he said. He would take all those policemen away at a stroke if the pickets weren't there. Who sends the pickets there? You do.
We send the pickets there, and we've sent pickets there for 150 years. It's not we who changed any rules in the game. It's the police and the central government tactics. And you see, let's get one thing clear. It's 2,000 of my members who've been injured and taken to hospital, not the police or other miners or other workers. And secondly, we've had 5,600 of our people arrested, and more important, 2 of my members have been killed on picket lines as a result of trying to do a job on behalf of this union, save pits, jobs and mining communities.
But given all those things which you express, given all those points you make, can you really justify intensifying the picketing now? Shouldn't you, in the interest of public safety at least, call it off or at least subdue it?
You know, it amazes me. The biggest pickets that have ever been seen in this country have been, by and large, quiet and orderly. You take the one that's often referred to as Saltley Gates in Birmingham. I was there. There were 25,000 people there. Not one injury, not one arrest, and not one incident. And as far as I'm concerned, if you look at what takes place both in the coalfields and wider at power stations and steelworks, you don't have the problems that he refers to. The intimidation and the brutality and the violence has come from the police during this dispute, and I saw scenes at Orgreave that were reminiscent of Chile or Bolivia, with police officers going absolutely berserk and hitting miners on the back of their head, whose only defence was a pair of jeans, plimsolls and a T-shirt.
Mr Scargill, the police force of this country is manned by people like you and me. It's manned by the working classes. They grow up in your community. In Yorkshire, they drink in the same clubs and pubs. They have the same leisure pursuits. Are you saying that just because they put on a different helmet to go to work, they suddenly become enemies of the working classes, that they deliberately start all this? They're the ones throwing the stones? Because if you are, I must suggest to you that you're stretching the credibility of the British public.
Tell you what, it may be that those people that you talk about are like you, but they're certainly not like me. I don't associate myself with people who brutally beat down unarmed miners and unarmed women in full riot gear with truncheons. That's not something that I associate myself with. And I'll tell you something else. I don't believe for one second that the majority of people in this country who do believe in democracy have any time whatsoever for a situation where we are now establishing a police state. You and I don't associate ourselves, surely, with police tactics of stopping ordinary citizens on the motorway, and if they find that you're going to go picketing, they arrest you, when after all, if you're going to a football match and they think that you're going to be a rowdy, they don't stop you or arrest you. Now, there's something radically wrong in 1984 when they're doing these things.
There's also something radically wrong, Mr. Scargill, with some of your members, anyway, forming those picket lines and, without any shadow of a doubt, starting at least some of that trouble. Now, doesn't the fact that you have consistently failed to condemn that violence actually encourage them?
Now, what it does is this. It shows that I've got commitment to those that I'm very privileged to represent. See, I haven't heard Mrs. Thatcher condemn the police force once, and yet she must have seen, even on your television screens, witnessed scenes of brutality, the like of which we've never seen in Britain. Scenes like at Orgreave, when a police officer was seen repeatedly beating over the head a young minor whose only defence was a pair of jeans and a T-shirt. Now, come on, you're not asking me to condemn that young lad whose only crime is fighting for the right to work, are you?
No, but let me talk about another form of intimidation which worries people just as much. The instance this week of a man, one of your members presumably, wanting to go to work at Bilston Glen Colliery, suddenly finding 40 men outside his house, preventing him, or trying to prevent him, from going to work. Can you honestly put your hand on your heart and say to me that you condone that kind of behaviour?
Let me be perfectly clear. The only reason why miners were in that situation is because the police, who are being used as an instrument of government against the miners in this strike, are preventing pickets talking to people who are saying they're going to go into work.
Does that justify them preventing this man to exercise his freedom of choice and go to work?
The only reason that they're trying to talk to people, say, outside his home, is because they're being denied the time-honoured and, as far as I was aware, legal right to talk to people going into work. Now, when you go in a bus or in a car with police escort driven at high speed through a picket line, it's little wonder that people begin to get frustrated. For years and years, nearly 100 years, people in the working class in Britain have had the right to talk to people. I remember coming, for example, to do an interview at a television station and finding a picket line. They were able to talk to me. I turned back, I didn't come through it. All we're saying is, if we're given the opportunity to talk to people, then at least we will not witness scenes like you describe. It's because we've been prevented from the right to picket.
Are you seriously telling me that 40 men turned up outside this man's house for a quiet, gentle chit-chat?
I'm telling you that miners are trying to talk to other workers and say, join our dispute, because what's at stake is the future of your pit, your job and your community. And that is something that I believe most people would support. The fact is that we have not had miners who are going to work injured. The people who've been injured in this dispute are the miners who are on strike. It's them who've had the living daylights beaten out of them, and not as the Chief Constable of Nottingham would have you believe.
Mr. Scargill, I'm going to pause you there. We're going to take another break and continue the chat after that. Stay with us. In case you're just joining us, let me tell you that I'm talking to Mr. Arthur Scargill about the miners' dispute. Mr. Scargill, we're talking there about the picketing and some of the trouble that's been caused on the picket lines. One other point I want to put to you is this. Would you concede that, irrespective of who's to blame, the effect on many of the communities in which your members live has been devastating and may, in fact, take years to heal the wounds?
Oh, I think that is certainly true. The fact that we've we had this kind of confrontation right the way through the British industrial scene in this particular mining dispute is a fact of life. I regret the fact that we've not yet been able to persuade all our members to join the dispute. We've still got 80% of our members on strike. I only wish that 100% were on strike, because if they were, we'd have won this dispute already.
But do you think that's a reasonable price to pay in order to achieve your aims?
I don't think that the miners have any alternative but to fight against the pit closure programme.
Irrespective of the cost?
Well, I don't think it's a question of irrespective of the cost. I think the cost in terms of the destruction of mining communities and the way of life that we have is certainly incomparable with anything else that you can possibly describe. I think that the sooner other miners who are still going to work recognise that they're fighting for their own jobs and their own situation, the better. See, even in Nottinghamshire, 50% of all South Nottinghamshire pits are threatened under this closure programme. That's stated by the National Coal Board in official transcript notes. And I would remind people in the Nottinghamshire coalfield or in the Midlands coalfields or wherever that they're fighting for their own survival, not merely South Wales or Scotland.
You've also called upon other trade unions on this programme a little earlier to support you, but I'm bound to ask you, where's that support going to come? The steelmen don't want to help you. The electricity supply industry indicated last week that they don't want to help you either. The railman support has been half-hearted. Coal is still coming in through the ports. Coal is still being transported on the roads, despite the TNG's stance on the subject. Where's that support going to come from?
Well, that support has already been magnificent. Let me correct the impression you've just created. The National Union of Seamen have not handled one single ship since this dispute began. The National Union of Railwaymen and ASLEF, the two railway unions, are not moving coal or coke or iron ore. And my latest information is that there's 96% of all coal and coke movement now stopped. There's a very one isolated incident, and they hope to bring that to a standstill. We've also had tremendous support from the Transport and General Workers Union as well, and there has been support from the wider movement, both in terms of finance and also in terms of physical support by demonstrating on our picket lines. And so there is that support there. What we're saying to, yes to the steel workers and yes to the power workers, is that they ought to be supporting us and refusing to accept deliveries of coal or coke which is being taken in by scab lorry drivers.
Why should they do that and put their own jobs on the line?
People should do this because the whole trade union movement was built on a very important principle, and that is that when workers are involved in a dispute, you don't cross a picket line. Now, if you adhere strictly to that principle, you're not only supporting those workers who are on strike, you're supporting yourselves, because the time will come, and it will not be in the distant future, when your job and your industry could be facing the same problem.
But I must put it to you,
and you will want the same help.
They've already had that discussion with themselves, and most of them have decided they don't want to know, frankly. And in that sense, your dispute has failed.
I'm sorry, that's not true. And if you look back in recent history, say to 1972, at the start of that dispute, we didn't have widespread support either. And there were even people like the media. I mean, I wouldn't think that you for one moment would suggest that we weren't winning, but naturally there were those commentators who were facetious, who were saying that we wouldn't get support, and workers were saying we wouldn't get support. That changed dramatically, and I can tell you one thing. When I travel throughout Britain, both in terms of workers, in trade unions, and yes, in the wider public, there is a tremendous growth of support for the miners' union, because the principle at stake, the right to work and the campaign to save pits, is one that they can associate with.
I know you don't even contemplate defeat, but just think about it hypothetically. If you were to lose, what would you do? Would you consider quitting?
Now, you promised you wouldn't ask silly questions on this programme, and there you go asking them. You know, I don't contemplate defeat, that's true, and neither do I contemplate silly questions. Here we've got a dispute that so far has cost the taxpayers £3.5 billion. We've lost 50 million tonnes of coal production as a result of one woman, Mrs Thatcher's determination to try and smash a union, not create an industry that can meet energy needs of Britain. As far as I'm concerned, we're going to win this dispute, win the right to work, and save our communities.
Mr Scargill, thank you very much indeed for joining us. That's it from me. I'll be back with Annie, same time tomorrow. Bye-bye.